The rust-colored dust of what was once Chicago settled in Elias Thorne's lungs, a familiar grit he'd been breathing for all his 27 years. He moved through the skeletal remains of the city, a place the survivors called the rib cage, where skyscrapers lay toppled against each other like the bones of some colossal, long-dead beast. Above, the sky was a permanent, sickly bruise of violet and gray, a result of the atmospheric processors the architects had installed after the culling. Elias was a scrapper, a grave robber of a dead civilization, picking through the innards of fallen architect vessels and pre-invasion ruins for anything that might keep him alive another cycle. Survival was a quiet, grinding affair, punctuated by the low, omnipresent hum of the nearest architect tower, a monolithic spire of obsidian metal that pierced the clouds and broadcasted a signal of absolute peace. It was a frequency that soothed, that pacified, that scrubbed away the sharp edges of memory and rage, leaving only the dull instinct to endure. Most people welcomed it, a drug that made the end of the world bearable. Elias hated it. He hated it with a silent, simmering fury that he had to consciously nurture, a secret fire he stoked in the back of his mind to keep the tower's lullaby from claiming him completely. It was that buried anger that drove him deeper into the scrap fields than the others dared to go, into the toxic, radiation-soaked hearts of downed alien dreadnoughts where the real prizes were hidden. Today's prize was a Leviathan-class harvester, a behemoth that had crashed during the final days of the war, its metallic corpse half buried in the desiccated basin of what was once Lake Michigan. Its outer hull had been picked clean years ago, but Elias knew the true treasures were always nested deep within, past the tangled conduits still leaking neurotoxins and the defense systems that could occasionally flicker back to life. He moved with a practiced grace, his thin frame slipping through gaps in the wreckage, his rebreather muffling the sound of his own ragged breaths. The hum of the tower was weaker here, dampened by 100,000 tons of alien alloy. And in the relative quiet, his own thoughts felt sharper, more dangerous. He remembered his mother's face, a memory that was usually a blurred watercolor. Now, for a moment, it was a photograph, clear and painful. He remembered the sky burning, the screams swallowed by the roar of descending ships. The tower wanted him to forget that, to accept the sterile tranquility of this new world. But forgetting felt like a second death, a betrayal he refused to commit. Inside the Leviathan's command bridge, or what was left of it, he found a sealed chamber. The door was fused shut, untouched. It wasn't architect design. The lines were too crude, too human. A surge of adrenaline, cold and sharp, cut through him, using a plasma cutter scavenged from a Sentinel drone. He sliced through the lock with painstaking care. The air that hissed out was stale, ancient, and cold enough to frost the edges of the opening. Inside was not a weapons cache or a data core, but something impossible, a ghost from a history the architects had meticulously erased. It was a human cryopod, sleek and military grade, its status light blinking a slow, steady green. Etched onto its side was a symbol he'd only ever seen in fragmented, forbidden data files, a winged shield clutching a bolt of lightning, the insignia of the Aegis Protocol, Earth's last unified fighting force, a legion of warriors the architects claimed to have vaporized to the last soul in the first hour of the culling. The journey back to his burrow was a blur of paranoia. He hauled the heavy pod on a modified grav sled, keeping to the shadows of the ribcage's deepest canyons, his head on a swivel, watching for the insect-like sentinels that patrolled the ruins. Possessing pre-culling technology was a capital offense, a direct violation of the architect's one and only law, do not remember what you were. To be caught with an Aegis cryopod was not just a death sentence, it was an invitation for a localized purge. He secured it in his workshop, a hollowed-out section of an old subway station, shielded by layers of lead and scrap plating that helped block the tower's signal. For 3 days, he just stared at it. The pod sat in the center of his cluttered space, a stark white coffin surrounded by the detritus of his life, dismantled energy cells, patched up water purifiers, and the single pulse rifle he'd painstakingly rebuilt, a weapon he prayed he would never have to use. The woman inside was a silhouette against the frosted glass, her features obscured but undeniably human. A soldier, a relic of a time when humanity fought back. The tower's hum seemed to press in on him, a physical weight on his skull, whispering temptations of compliance. Let it go. Forget you ever saw it. Survival is in the silence. But every time he looked at the pod, the fire in his gut burned brighter. The clear image of his mother's face, her hand reaching for him as the sky fell, returned again and again. She hadn't been a soldier, but she had fought, a terrified civilian trying to shield her son from the end of the world. The architects had erased her, and millions like her, and then they had the audacity to offer peace. It was the peace of the tomb, the quiet of the graveyard. Elias made his decision on the 4th day. He wasn't just a scrapper. He was the son of a woman who deserved to be remembered. He was the inheritor of a rage that deserved a voice. He would open the pod. The procedure was a violent, delicate dance. He had to bypass the military-grade encryption and then hotwire the revival sequence, a process that would drain every last drop of power from his scavenged generators. The workshop lights flickered and died as he rerouted everything to the pod. The roar of the generators kicking into overdrive was deafening, a flagrant announcement of his crime to anyone or anything that might be listening. He worked with frantic precision, his hands steady despite the tremor running through his body. Sweat dripped from his brow, sizzling on the hot casing of a power conduit. As the final connection was made, the cryopod whirred to life, its internal mechanisms groaning like a waking giant. A wave of super-chilled gas billowed out, clinging to the floor in a thick white fog. And then it happened. A sound he had never heard before cut through the city, a piercing shriek that vibrated in his very bones. It wasn't a broadcast. It was an alarm. The architect tower, the silent shepherd of their flock, had screamed. The pacifying hum was gone, replaced by a focused, aggressive pulse of pure psychic pressure that felt like a spike being driven into his brain. Across the ribcage, dormant sentinel drones, their metallic bodies covered in decades of rust and grime, began to stir. Red optical sensors flickered to life in the darkness of the city's underbelly, their limbs unfolding with the dry crackle of long unused joints. The pod hissed open. The woman inside, her skin pale and etched with frost, took a ragged, shuddering gasp, her lungs pulling in the foul air of the dead world for the first time in over 200 years. Her eyes snapped open. They were not the disoriented, confused eyes of someone waking from a long sleep. They were the color of a winter storm, and they were filled with a cold, clear fury that mirrored the fire in his own soul. Her gaze locked onto him, sharp and analytical. She pushed herself up, her movements stiff but economical. Her first word wasn't a question of where she was or what had happened. It was a command, rasped from a throat raw with disuse. "Report." Outside, the grinding screech of metal on concrete grew louder. The sentinels were coming. The alarms of his workshop blared, a frantic, futile warning. Elias grabbed his pulse rifle, the cold stock a familiar and terrifying comfort in his hands. He had just traded his quiet, miserable life of survival for a war he had only known through fragmented nightmares. In awakening this ghost, he had reminded the architects that they had missed one. The psychic shriek intensified, a physical blow that made Elias's teeth ache and his vision swim with static. But the woman, Kaylin, merely flinched, her eyes narrowing as if against a harsh glare. Her combat-honed instincts overrode the agony, her mind a fortress against the tower's assault. She took in the workshop in a single, sweeping glance, the scavenged tools, the makeshift barricades, the single pathetic pulse rifle in Elias's trembling hands. "Architects," she stated. Not a question, but a diagnosis. The name felt like a shard of glass on Elias's tongue. "They're here. They won." A deafening crash punctuated his words as the first sentinel, a hulking, six-legged machine built for pacification and slaughter, tore through the reinforced steel door of his workshop as if it were paper. Its single red optic glowed with malevolent intent, its metallic limbs unfolding to fill the entrance. Elias froze, the sheer, sudden violence of it locking his muscles. But Kaylin moved. She was a blur of motion, grabbing a heavy-duty plasma torch from a workbench, its power cell glowing a weak orange. It wasn't a weapon, but in her hands, it became one. She sidestepped the sentinel's initial lunge, a clumsy and crushing blow that pulverized the spot where she'd been standing. She moved low, under its chassis, and drove the superheated tip of the torch directly into a cluster of hydraulic cabling at the joint of its primary leg. The sentinel spasmed, shrieking a high-frequency burst of machine pain as the leg seized and buckled. It was a moment's hesitation, but it was all she needed. She vaulted onto its back, ramming the torch into the casing around its optical sensor, melting through the armor with a spray of molten slag. The red light flickered and died. The machine crashed to the ground, twitching, inert. Kaylin landed lightly, the torch sputtering out in her hand. She didn't look at her handiwork. Her storm-gray eyes were already on Elias. "There will be more. This location is compromised. Route of egress now." Her voice, crisp and authoritative, broke his paralysis. He was the expert here, in this maze of urban decay. "This way." He choked out, leading her towards a concealed passage behind a rack of power cells, the old service tunnels. They run deeper than the sentinels usually patrol. They plunged into the darkness, a narrow, cylindrical passage slick with generations of grime. The sounds of their footsteps echoed off the curved walls, mingling with the distant, horrifying symphony of the city tearing itself apart. The tower's psychic screech was the conductor, and the terrified, confused citizens of the ribcage were its orchestra. Through cracks in the tunnel ceiling, they caught glimpses of the chaos above, people clawing at their own faces, screaming at unseen horrors, while others, driven mad by the sudden withdrawal of the pacifying hum, turned on each other with savage, mindless violence. The peace of the architects had been a fragile cage, and now the animals were loose. How long, Kaylin asked, her voice tight as they navigated the labyrinthine tunnels by the beam of Elias's headlamp. She moved with an unnerving confidence in the dark, her senses seeming to pierce the gloom. How long has it been Elias had to stop, leaning against the cold, damp concrete to catch his breath? The culling was over 200 years ago. By the old calendar, the beam of his light caught her face. For the first time, a crack appeared in her soldier's facade. Her expression didn't crumble, but a flicker of profound, bottomless loss passed through her eyes. The look of someone staring into a freshly dug grave that was large enough to hold a world. 200 years. She whispered, the words barely audible. My orders were to hold the line at the Chicago exclusion zone. We were waiting for reinforcements from Aegis Command. Elias shook his head, the gesture grim in the dancing light. There is no Aegis Command. There is no Chicago. There's only the ribcage and the tower and them. He didn't need to elaborate. She understood. She was a soldier whose war had been lost centuries before she woke up. They emerged into the lower levels of the city, a place of perpetual twilight where the skeletal skyscrapers blotted out the bruised sky. Here, the destruction was even more profound. The wreckage wasn't just of buildings, but of architect technology. Elias pointed to a massive, segmented husk that looked like a fallen metal serpent, its body wrapped around the base of 3 ruined towers. That's a world burner, he said, his voice hushed with a scrapper's reverence. It's what they used to boil the oceans and scorch the continents. The culling wasn't a war. It was pest control. Kaelin stared at the colossal machine, her jaw tight. We fought them to a standstill at Proxima, she said, her voice a low growl of disbelief. We broke their fleet. How did they get here? How did they win so completely? It was a question Elias had asked himself 1,000 times, piecing together the answer from corrupted data files and the forbidden whispers of old scrappers. They didn't break through our lines, he explained, pulling her along, keeping to the deepest shadows. They bypassed them. Their signal came first. Before the first shot was fired in system, the towers were already here, already broadcasting. They put us to sleep before they killed us. Most people never even knew they were at war. They just laid down in the streets and let the fire wash over them. Her silence was heavy, freighted with the weight of that unimaginable betrayal. They were moving across a rusted sky bridge connecting 2 leaning towers when a new sound cut through the chaos. It wasn't the clumsy grinding of a standard sentinel. It was a near-silent, predatory hiss. Elias felt a cold dread snake down his spine. He'd heard tales of them, phantoms that hunted scrappers who got too bold, but he'd never seen one. A hunter, sleeker, faster, and horrifyingly intelligent. It appeared at the far end of the bridge, its form a nightmarish fusion of black alloy and razor-sharp limbs, its body slung low to the ground like a panther. Unlike the Sentinels, it had 2 optical sensors, glowing with a piercing blue light that scanned the area with cold, analytical precision. Go, Kaelin hissed, pushing him forward. Don't stop. She unslung the pulse rifle from his back, checking its charge with an expert's touch. This piece of junk has maybe 5 shots left. Make them count. They ran. The bridge groaned under their feet, threatening to give way. The hunter bounded after them, its movements fluid and impossibly fast. Kaelin fired a shot, the bolt of blue energy striking the hunter's shoulder. It barely slowed it down, just scarred its black armor and made it angrier. It let out a digital shriek, a sound that grated on the nerves, and increased its speed. It's learning. Kalen grunted, firing again, this time aiming for a support strut above the hunter. The blast weakened the rusted metal, sending a shower of debris down. But the hunter simply dodged and kept coming. They were running out of bridge. The echo chamber, Elias yelled over the wind and the screech of stressed metal. It's an old communications hub, deep underground, shielded. The tower's signal can't get in. It's the only safe place left. He pointed towards the base of the tower they were running to, where a massive, circular blast door was set into the foundation, covered in decades of debris. The entrance, their only hope. They leapt from the end of the sky bridge, landing hard on a pile of rubble and sliding the last 20 feet to the door. The hunter was right behind them, leaping with terrifying grace, its bladed limbs extended. "Open it!" Kalen screamed, turning to face their pursuer, bracing the rifle for one last shot. The door's controls were dead. A thick manual release wheel, rusted solid, was the only way in. Elias threw his entire body weight against it, his muscles screaming in protest. It didn't budge. He could hear the fight behind him, the crackle of the pulse rifle, the shriek of metal on metal. He risked a glance. Kalen was dodging, weaving, using the environment, forcing the hunter into tight spaces, but she was outmatched. The machine was too strong, too fast. Its bladed forelimb lashed out, catching her across the ribs, tearing through her thin jacket, and sending her stumbling back with a sharp cry of pain. Rage, pure and undiluted, flooded Elias's system. The fire he'd nurtured for so long finally exploded. With a guttural roar, he slammed a scavenged crowbar into the release wheel's mechanism, leveraging it with every ounce of his strength. There was a deafening crack as the gears, frozen for 2 centuries, finally broke free. The massive blast door began to groan open, a vertical slit of perfect darkness appearing in the chaos. The hunter, seeing its prey about to escape, disengaged from Kalen and charged towards the opening door. It was going to get through, but Elias had spent a lifetime learning the secrets of this city's corpse. He knew its weaknesses. His eyes darted up to the crumbling concrete overhang directly above the entrance, a section of the building he'd noted years ago as dangerously unstable. He grabbed the last of Kalen's spent plasma torch, its tip still holding a faint residual heat, and jammed it into a fissure in the concrete that was weeping a thick, flammable-looking fluid from a ruptured conduit. The effect was instantaneous. A small explosion, then a larger one. As the fluid ignited within the decaying structure, the entire overhang collapsed in a thunderous avalanche of concrete and steel, directly on top of the charging hunter. The machine was buried, its shriek cut off in a final, grinding crunch of metal. Kalen dragged him through the gap just as the last of the rubble sealed the entrance from the outside. The blast door, its mechanism now broken, slid shut with a deep, final boom that echoed in the sudden, absolute silence. They were plunged into total darkness. The psychic shriek of the tower was gone, replaced by the sound of their own ragged breathing and the drip of water somewhere in the vast, black space. They were safe, for now. Elias's headlamp flickered back on, its beam cutting a lonely path through the oppressive dark of the echo chamber. He turned to Kalen. She was slumped against the cold steel of the door, her face pale, one hand pressed against her bleeding side. The adrenaline was fading, and for the first time since she woke up, the soldier was gone. In her place was a woman, 200 years adrift in the ruins of her own world, wounded, alone, and utterly, terrifyingly lost. The silence of the echo chamber was a presence, a physical weight that pressed in after the cacophony of the tower's psychic assault. It was a dead quiet, the kind found only in tombs. Elias's headlamp beam was the only thing moving in the vast, cavernous space, dancing across surfaces that swallowed the light. The air was cold and carried the scent of ozone and ancient dust. He rushed to Kaylin's side. The gash in her ribs was deep, a clean, surgical cut from the hunter's bladed limb. Her makeshift Oseti first-century fatigues were soaked in a rapidly spreading patch of dark blood. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at him. Scrappers didn't have medics. A wound like this in the rib cage was a death sentence, a slow slide into infection and fever. But Kaylin was already in motion. Medkit, she grunted, her voice strained with pain. My pod. Emergency release compartment on the exterior port side. Go. The thought of going back out there, into the madness, was paralyzing, but the look in her eyes not of fear, but of grim, unwavering command left no room for argument. The entrance is blocked, he stammered, gesturing to the mountain of rubble. I can't get through. She shook her head, a slight pained motion. There's more than one way into a tomb. This place, it's a comms hub. It has to connect to the network, find a service conduit, a ventilation shaft, something, leaving her propped against the door, a pool of her blood slowly gathering at her feet, was one of the hardest things he'd ever done. He plunged into the darkness of the echo chamber, his light a fragile spear against the gloom. The place was immense, a cathedral of forgotten technology. Ranks of silent server towers stood like monolithic gravestones, their surfaces coated in a thick blanket of dust. Catwalks crisscrossed the space high above, lost in the shadows. He found what he was looking for at the far end of the chamber, a series of maintenance shafts, their hatches sealed with rusted bolts. He worked with a feverish intensity, his crowbar groaning in protest as he forced the corroded metal. The shaft was a tight squeeze, barely wider than his shoulders, and descended into a claustrophobic network of smaller tunnels. It was a part of the city's underbelly he'd never explored, a place where the pre-culling world still slept. The journey was a nightmarish crawl through darkness and decay. At one point, he had to push through a thick, rubbery mass that had grown across the tunnel. His light revealed it to be a bizarre, fungal-like growth, pulsing with a faint, internal bioluminescence, an alien life form that had taken root in the corpse of the old world. He finally emerged into the familiar territory of the subway tunnels near his workshop, the psychic shriek of the tower returning. Though it was muffled and less intense this deep underground, the workshop was a wreck, torn apart by the Sentinel. But the cryopod stood untouched, an incongruous artifact of pristine technology amidst the chaos. He found the compartment, a small panel that popped open with a hiss, revealing a compact, military-grade medical kit. Inside were items he'd only ever seen in fragmented schematics, a dermal regenerator that looked like a small pistol, autosutures, and vials of opaque liquid, labeled with terms like coagulant and broad-spectrum antibiotic. He grabbed it and began the treacherous journey back, his heart pounding with a desperate, unfamiliar hope. He returned to find Kaylin exactly where he had left her, but her breathing was shallower, her skin colder. She was losing too much blood. He worked under her terse, gasped instructions, Clean the wound. The saline spray. Now the coagulant. Inject directly into the tissue. Hurry. His hands, usually so steady when dismantling a complex energy cell, trembled as he administered the advanced medicine. The dermal regenerator was the final step. As he passed the device over her wound, a pale blue light emanated from its tip, and the flesh began to knit itself together with an unnatural speed, leaving a raw, pink scar where a fatal gash had been moments before. She let out a long, shuddering breath as the last of the bleeding stopped, her body slumping in exhaustion. "Thank you," she whispered, the words carrying a weight of genuine, raw gratitude that startled him. He just nodded, his own adrenaline finally crashing, leaving him feeling hollowed out and shaky. For the next few hours, a fragile truce with death settled over them in the dark. Kalen drifted in and out of a shallow, pain-filled sleep while Elias stood guard, his pulse rifle now useless without a charge held like a club. He scavenged what he could from the echo chamber's emergency supply lockers, stale nutrient paste, purified water, and a handful of chemical light sticks that cast the cavern in an eerie, green glow. The silence gave him time to think, and his thoughts circled back to Kalen. She was more than just a soldier. She was a living key, a ghost who remembered a world where humanity had a spine. When she finally woke, her eyes were clear, the pain having receded to a dull ache. She sat up, testing her patched wound with a grimace. "The tower," she said, her voice stronger. "It's signal. It's not just a pacification field. It's a weapon. I've never felt a psychic assault that targeted, that precise." Elias nodded, crumbling a piece of nutrient paste in his hand. "It's always been there. The hum. It keeps people calm, makes them forget. But I've never seen it do that. It's like it knew you were awake. It reacted." Kalen's gaze sharpened. "It's a network. The tower in the ribcage is just one node, a warden for this sector. When I woke up, my Aegis neural implant rebooted. It's 2 centuries out of date, but for a split second, before the tower's shriek overwhelmed it, it registered the network. There are thousands of them, all over the planet. A planetary prison grid." She pushed herself to her feet, her movements still stiff. "My last orders were to rendezvous at a continuity of government site, codename Bastion. It was a deep-range communications hub, shielded against orbital and psychic attack. If any part of the command structure survived, they'd be there. A sliver of hope. Irrational and dangerous, pierced through Elias's ingrained cynicism. "You think people are there, after 200 years? "No," she said, her voice flat. "I think the facility is there, and its records, the logs, the schematics for Aegis weaponry, the location of every hidden cache and bunker we built before the fall. Everything the architects have tried to erase. Bastion isn't a place to find survivors. It's a place to find teeth." The idea was insane. 2 people, armed with nothing, against a planetary network of godlike machines. But the alternative was to go back to the quiet despair of the ribcage, to a life of waiting for the end. Looking at Kalen, at the unyielding iron in her eyes, he knew he could never go back. He had opened the coffin, and now he had to walk with the ghost that had stepped out. "How do we find it?" he asked. Bastion's location was never digitized. It was kept on physical data chits, distributed to command-level officers. "My chit is in my gear." She gestured back towards the blocked entrance. in the cryopod. The problem remained how to get out. But as they spoke, Elias's eye was drawn to the center of the echo chamber. A massive, circular platform sat there, ringed by dormant consoles. It was the hub's primary broadcast antenna, a dish aimed at the heavens. He'd always assumed it was dead, like everything else in the city. But what if it wasn't? The tower controls the city. He thought aloud, his scrapper's mind piecing together a desperate, reckless plan. The Sentinels, the Hunters, they're all networked. But this place, this is older, pre-invasion. What if we can't just hide from the signal? What if we can fight it? Kaylin followed his gaze, understanding dawning on her face. You want to use their own network against them. A feedback loop. Drown out the tower's signal with a blast of raw, chaotic noise. It was a suicide play. Activating the hub would be like setting off a flare in the deepest, darkest ocean, attracting every predator for 1,000 miles. We'd need a massive power source, Elias said, his voice gaining excitement. The main conduits are dead, but there's a sublevel, a geothermal tap. The old city ran on it. If I can get it online, it might be enough to power the dish for one short, focused burst. It would buy us a window. Kaylin finished, a dangerous glint in her eyes. While the local network is blinded and in chaos, we get out, get the chit, and disappear. Their path was set. Elias, with his intimate knowledge of the city's dead anatomy, would navigate the treacherous lower levels to the geothermal plant. Kaylin, despite her injury, would stay and work on the broadcast hub's controls, trying to interface her 23rd century neural implant with the ancient system. As Elias prepared to descend into the bowels of the earth, he stopped and looked back at her. She stood bathed in the green glow of the light sticks, a figure from another age, her shadow long and defiant against the wall of silent machines. Elias, she said, her voice stopping him. When I woke up, I thought I was the last one, the last soldier. He met her gaze. You are, he said softly. But you're not the last person willing to fight. For the first time, something that might have been a smile touched Kaylin's lips. It was a grim, hard thing, but it was a start. He turned and descended into the darkness, the fate of their impossible rebellion resting on his ability to resurrect a machine that had been dead for centuries. The descent into the ribcage's geothermal core was a journey into the planet's gut. The service shafts, once pristine conduits for engineers, were now choked with the grotesque biology of the new Earth. Elias moved through tunnels slick with phosphorescent slime and past crystalline structures that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light, alien growths that had fed on the leaking energy of the dying city for 200 years. The air grew thick and hot, smelling of sulfur and ozone. He was in a realm untouched by the architects, a place their sterilizing culling had somehow missed. Down here, life, in its most bizarre and resilient forms, had persisted. He navigated by memory and instinct, following the thick, armored power conduits that snaked their way deeper into the crust. He was a ghost in the machine's circulatory system, his headlamp a single blood cell moving through dead veins. Twice he had to backtrack, his path blocked by cave-ins or by tunnels flooded with a black, viscous liquid that steamed where it touched metal. He felt the weight of the dead city above him, a pressure that was more than just physical. He was carrying the hope of one person, Kaylin, and it felt heavier than all the tons of rubble and steel. The geothermal plant was a breathtaking sight, a cavern of industry built on a scale that dwarfed the echo chamber. A massive, spherical reactor was suspended in the center of the chamber by a web of colossal girders. Its surface a patchwork of dormant heat sinks and access ports. A river of magma flowed in a deep channel beneath it, its dull red glow providing the only light. The place was a monument to the ambition of his ancestors, a testament to a time when humanity commanded the very heart of their world. Now, it was a sleeping god, and his job was to wake it. The primary ignition console was, predictably, dead. He spent hours prying open control panels, his light glinting off a dizzying array of fused circuits and melted wiring. It was a scrapper's nightmare and a scrapper's dream. He was salvaging not for parts, but for a future. He worked methodically, cannibalizing secondary systems, rerouting auxiliary power, his hands moving with the certainty of a surgeon. He was no engineer, but he knew how machines breathed, how they bled, and how to shock them back to life. He found his solution in an emergency startup sequence, a manual override designed for a catastrophic system failure. It required him to physically connect 3 primary energy junctions in a precise, timed sequence. The junctions were massive, set far apart on the reactor's superstructure, accessible only by a series of precarious, rust-eaten catwalks suspended over the river of magma. Meanwhile, back in the echo chamber, Kaylin fought a different kind of war. She had pried open the main console of the broadcast antenna, revealing a tangle of fiber optics and crystal data processors that were alien to her 23rd century military tech. But the principles were the same. She found an interface port and, with a grimace of pain, connected a fine wire from the console directly to the data jack at the base of her skull. The world dissolved into a waterfall of raw, corrupted data. It was a torrent of meaningless information, 2 centuries of digital decay. Her Aegis implant, designed to interface with advanced battle networks, struggled to make sense of the archaic system. She pushed deeper, using her own mind as a filter, a search engine powered by sheer will. She wasn't just trying to activate the machine, she was trying to aim it. A raw, omnidirectional blast would cause chaos, but a focused one, aimed directly at the tower's primary frequency, could cripple it. She felt the tower's presence at the edge of the system, a silent, orderly consciousness, a spider in the center of a vast web. It was aware of her probing, its attention a cold, dispassionate pressure on her mind. She shielded her thoughts, burying her intentions under layers of junk data, pretending to be nothing more than a system glitch. The strain was immense. Blood trickled from her nose, and the scar on her ribs burned with phantom pain. But she held on, a ghost in their machine, planting a logic bomb at the heart of their network. The climb to the first junction was a trial by fire. The heat from the magma below was a physical force, warping the air and making the metal of the catwalks hot enough to scorch the soles of his boots. The first switch, a massive lever encrusted with crystallized minerals, took all his strength to throw. As it slammed home, a low, deep hum resonated from the reactor, the first sign of life in 2 centuries. The structure shuddered, and a shower of rust and debris rained down from the ceiling. He raced against time, the rumbling beneath his feet growing stronger as the reactor began to draw power. The second catwalk was partially collapsed, and he had to make a desperate leap across a 10-foot gap, the river of fire churning hungrily below. He hit the other side hard, his ribs screaming in protest. But he scrambled up and threw the second switch. Lights flickered on around the chamber, weak and erratic, casting long, dancing shadows. The hum deepened into a powerful, ground-shaking roar. The reactor was waking up. As he started for the third and final junction, a new sound joined the roar, the high-pitched screech of metal. From alcoves in the cavern walls he hadn't noticed before, maintenance drones, ancient and skeletal, began to activate. They were simple machines, not weapons like the Sentinels, but their purpose was clear: to maintain the reactor's stability. And his presence, a foreign body in the system, was the ultimate instability. They swarmed towards him, their manipulator claws snapping. He ran, the drones scuttling after him with unnatural speed. The final catwalk was swaying violently as the entire chamber shook with the reactor's reawakening. He was halfway across when a drone leaped onto his back, its weight nearly sending him over the edge. He slammed himself backwards into a railing, crushing the machine, its limbs flailing before it went limp. Another one lunged, and he swung his crowbar, a desperate, clumsy blow that sent it spiraling into the magma below, where it vanished with a brief, intense flash of light. He reached the final junction, a large, red button under a cracked protective casing. He smashed the casing with his crowbar and slammed his palm down on the button. The effect was instantaneous. A blinding column of blue-white energy erupted from the top of the reactor, slamming into the cavern's ceiling and bathing the entire chamber in an intense, actinic light. The geothermal plant was online. The power surge hit the echo chamber like a physical blow. The lights on Kalen's console flashed from red to brilliant green. "Now, Elias," she whispered, her eyes closed, her mind fully immersed in the digital stream. She triggered her logic bomb. On the main console, a single, pure sine wave, the Architect Tower's pacification frequency, was displayed. Then, from Kalen's command, 1,000 chaotic, screaming signals erupted, a torrent of digital noise that slammed into the pure wave, shattering it for a single, glorious moment. The echo chamber's ancient antenna became a weapon, firing a focused, high-energy data scythe directly at the heart of the enemy's control. Across the ribcage, the effect was apocalyptic. The tower's psychic shriek didn't just stop, it was torn apart. The pulse of chaotic energy overloaded its systems. Lights flickered across the tower's obsidian surface before a cascade of explosions tore up its side. The monolithic structure, the symbol of humanity's subjugation, began to fracture. Sentinels and hunters across the city seized up, their limbs locking as they were hit with a storm of contradictory commands. Before their optical sensors went dark, the psychic pressure vanished, replaced by a sudden, terrifying silence. People in the streets, those who had survived the initial madness, stopped their screaming, looking around in a state of dazed, horrified confusion, their minds their own for the first time in their lives. The window was open. Elias, battered and bruised, scrambled back through the tunnels as the geothermal plant groaned, its systems struggling to handle the sudden, massive power draw. He burst into the echo chamber to see Kalen collapse, pulling the wire from her data jack as a stream of blood flowed from her nose. The antenna dish above them smoked and sparked, its systems fried. They had their silence, but it had cost them their only weapon. "Did it work?" he gasped, helping her up. She gave him a bloody, triumphant grin. We knocked the warden off his throne." Wasting no time, they cleared the rubble from the entrance. The inert, crushed body of the hunter, a silent testament to their first victory. They emerged into a city transformed. The sky was the same bruised purple, but the oppressive hum was gone. The silence was unnerving, filled only by the whisper of the wind through the metal bones of the city and the distant, confused cries of its newly awakened populace. They made their way to the workshop and retrieved the data chit from the cryopod. It was a small, metallic card, cool to the touch, holding the location of a place that, until now, had been nothing more than a myth. As Elias held the key to humanity's last arsenal, he looked at the wounded, smoking tower in the distance. They hadn't just survived. They had punched their jailer in the mouth. And now, for the first time in 200 years, the prisoners were loose. The silence they had unleashed was more terrifying than the shriek it replaced. In the absence of the tower's psychic lullaby, the rib cage woke up screaming. It was the sound of 200 years of suppressed memory, grief, and terror flooding back into minds that had been kept placid and empty. People stumbled through the canyons of scrap, clutching their heads, their eyes wide with the horror of a world they had been forced to forget. Some wept for families lost centuries ago. Others stared at their own aged hands. The passage of time, a sudden, brutal shock. A new, more primitive violence erupted, born not of architect control, but of pure human panic and despair. Elias and Kalen moved through this waking nightmare like ghosts, sticking to the shadows. Their goal, singular and absolute: get out. The city had become a trap, and the silence was the sound of the cage door swinging shut. Kalen, driven by a soldier's focus, moved with lethal efficiency. But Elias saw the toll the awakening was taking on the people, saw his own buried grief reflected in their tormented faces, and it was a heavier weight than any machine. "We need a vehicle," he said, his voice a low rasp as they hid behind the rusted hulk of a transport truck, watching a mob tear apart a food dispenser with their bare hands. And a way out of the basin. The old highways are collapsed. There's only one route that's probably still clear, the salt flats to the west. He led her to his ace in the hole, a project he had worked on for years in secret. In a hidden garage, buried beneath the collapsed floor of an old parking structure, sat the sand skimmer. It was a Frankenstein's monster of a machine, built on the chassis of an old industrial hauler, powered by a volatile but potent architect energy cell, and fitted with repulsor lifts scavenged from a downed sentinel. It was ugly, loud, and probably unstable, but it was fast, and it was theirs. The journey out of the ribcage was a desperate high-speed flight through chaos. The newly awakened citizens, seeing the skimmer, saw a prize, a means of escape, and they swarmed it. Elias pushed the makeshift vehicle to its limits, weaving through the skeletal remains of buildings as people lunged at them, their faces masks of desperation. Kalen was forced to fire the last few shots from the pulse rifle not at machines, but into the air. The warning shots, a stark and brutal necessity to keep from being overrun. They finally broke free of the city's edge, leaving the cacophony of human misery behind them, and sped out onto the vast, empty expanse of the salt flats. What was once the breadbasket of a nation was now the glass sea, a seemingly endless plain of silica and fused earth, the result of the world burner's terrible work. The sky above was a vast, bruised canvas, and under it, they were utterly alone. a single scar of dust moving across a dead landscape. For 3 days, they traveled. The data chit, when slotted into the skimmer's crude navigation system, gave them a single heading west towards the spine of the continent, the Rocky Mountains. They spoke little, the silence of the wastes a welcome respite from the noise of the city. During the day, Elias drove, his knowledge of the broken land their map. At night, while he slept, Kaelin stood watch, a sentinel from a forgotten age, her eyes scanning the horizon for threats she was only now beginning to understand. She saw the true scale of the architect's victory not in the ruined city, but in the profound, absolute emptiness of the world. They hadn't just conquered humanity, they had erased its footprint. On the 4th day, their fragile peace was shattered. A patrol of 3 architect ships, sleek, silver teardrops that moved with silent grace, appeared over the horizon, sweeping the flats. The Chicago Tower might be blind, but the rest of the network was now on high alert. A desperate chase ensued. The skimmer was fast, but the architect ships were faster. Plasma bolts, brilliant and blue, tore up the earth around them, superheating the salt into glass. Elias drove like a madman, using the terrain, what little of it there was, to his advantage, dipping into ancient, dried-up riverbeds and canyons. Kaelin, her hands steady, managed to recalibrate the skimmer's salvaged energy cell, preparing to overload it. "If they get too close," she yelled over the roar of the engine, "I'm turning this entire vehicle into a bomb. It'll take them with us." It was not a plan for survival. It was a pact for vengeance. But Elias had one last trick. He steered them towards a region of the flats known to scrappers as the glitch fields, an area littered with the wreckage of the war, where lingering electromagnetic radiation and unstable architect tech made sensors go haywire. They plunged into the metallic graveyard at full speed. The architect ships followed, but their precise targeting systems were thrown into chaos by the electronic noise. One of the ships, flying too low, was impaled on the jagged spire of a downed Aegis battleship, its silver hull peeling open in a silent, fiery explosion. The other 2 hesitated, their cold machine logic weighing the risk. That hesitation was all Elias needed. He navigated the maze of wreckage and shot out the other side, disappearing into a narrow canyon before the remaining ships could reacquire their target. They had survived. But their luck, and the skimmer's power cell, was nearly spent. They abandoned the dying vehicle at the foothills of the mountains, continuing on foot. The climb was grueling. The air grew thin and cold, and the jagged peaks looked like the teeth of a dead god. The coordinates on the chit led them to a sheer, unremarkable cliff face in a secluded, windswept valley. There was no door, no entrance, nothing. "This is it," Elias said, his breath fogging in the cold. "The chit says this is the place." Kaelin ran her hand over the cold, hard rock. Bastion was shielded, not just electronically, physically. She found a small, almost invisible seam in the rock and pressed her palm against it. Nothing happened. "It's keyed," she whispered, a new, colder despair touching her voice. "Gene locked to Aegis Command personnel. I'm just a sergeant. My profile won't be high enough." For a moment, they just stood there, the weight of their impossible journey crashing down on them. They had crossed a dead continent, outrun the enemy, only to be defeated by a locked door. But Elias refused to accept it. He looked at the scanner on the console, a faint blue light that pulsed expectantly. Try it anyway, he urged. You're all that's left. If there's a machine in there, if there's anything, it has to know that. You are Aegis Command now. Kaylin took a deep breath. Her gaze hardening, she placed her hand on the scanner again. A beam of light scanned her palm, then her face. For a long, heart-stopping moment, there was only the sound of the wind. Then, a deep, grinding rumble echoed from within the mountain itself. The entire cliff face shuddered, and a section of what looked like solid rock retracted, revealing a cavernous opening that led into perfect, silent darkness. The air that flowed out was sterile and colder than the mountain peak, carrying a scent of long dormant machinery. They stepped inside, and the massive door sealed behind them, plunging them into silence and blackness. Then, lights flickered on, illuminating a vast, underground hangar. It was not a dusty ruin. It was pristine, untouched, sleek, black. Angular ships, unlike any Elias had ever seen, sat in ready stasis. Racks of advanced weaponry lined the walls, but there were no people. The entire facility was automated, crewed only by silent, hovering maintenance drones. A calm, disembodied voice, genderless and devoid of emotion, echoed through the hangar. Aegis Protocol continuity confirmed. Welcome home. Sergeant Kaylin, your 207-year debriefing is now scheduled. They had found it. They had found Bastion. It wasn't a refuge full of soldiers. It was an arsenal, a ghost fleet, and a cold, calculating intelligence that had been waiting for 2 centuries. Sleeping and watching from the heart of the mountain. Kaylin stood tall, the weight of her long-lost war settling back onto her shoulders. But this time, she was not alone. She looked at Elias, the scrapper who had dared to light a fire in the dark, and a silent understanding passed between them. Their fight for survival was over. Now, humanity's war of vengeance could truly begin. The voice spoke again, its tone unchanging, yet the words held the weight of a galaxy-shaking storm. Threat assessment complete. Enemy presence confirmed on a planetary scale. Strategic objective total eradication. Please state your command. Kaylin looked at the waiting fleet, at the racks of world-breaking weapons, and then at Elias. He gave a single, grim nod. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It was the voice of a ghost who had finally found her purpose, the voice of the first wave of a tide of fire. Let's begin.